No.
Okay, so let's dive in. So diversity is about understanding and appreciating the similarities and differences between people. The push in organizations is to have the organization to model the demographics of the employees and the community and customers that they serve. Our view of diversity is changing to one that used to be more about defensiveness to a real strategic value. Diversity adds to an organization so much, a broader range of perspectives and modes of thinking, which results in greater innovation, creativity, and problem solving capabilities. If everyone is the same, we would become very stagnant. I just skip one. So if diversity is who we are, inclusion is how do we make the people feel welcome. Inclusion is the extent to which each person within the organization feels welcomed, respected, supported, and valued as a team member. And they are truly two halves to a whole. Inclusion is how you leverage the diversity you have in the organization, and the diversity is the byproduct of effective inclusion, because people will want to join the organization if they believe they will be respected and valued. And in fact, you can have diversity without inclusion, and that is called covering. And there's typically a question about that on the exam. And covering is really a defensive behavior that occurs when an organization recruits a diverse workforce, but consciously or unconsciously promotes assimilation rather than inclusion. So to think about it, covering really looks like this. Yes, we definitely value diversity, but you really should dress like us, you should behave like us, you should identify with the culture that defines us. Don't advocate for or associate with your identity group. This creates a subtle message that you are welcome despite of who you are, not because of who you are. And so covering is really about, truly, it's about you don't value diversity and you don't value inclusiveness. Really what you value is people being exactly the same. So, because younger employees are coming over from developing countries or so many people are living outside of their home country, globalization forces are really starting to happen a lot in organizations, and therefore organizations are seeing the need and incredible value of embracing and championing diversity. Remember, we talked about demographic dichotomy last week, which is, remember that the younger developing countries' workforces are getting younger and not younger, and developed countries' workforce are older and older. We talked about diaspora, those people who are coming, large groups of people who are coming from one culture to another. But there are still real global challenges for diversity. For example, different cultures have very different attitudes and laws, specifically about women. There's so many benefits of diversity here, just a few that I can think of and that SHRM thought of, but I'll add some to that. Diverse cultural perspectives can increase and inspire creativity and drive innovation. Drawing from a culturally diverse talent pool allows an organization to attract and retain the best talent. Cultural sensitivity, insight, and local knowledge means higher quality targeted marketing. A diverse skill base allows an organization to offer a broader and more adaptable range of products and services. Diverse teams are more productive and perform better. And greater opportunity for personal and professional growth when there's a diverse environment. But there are also challenges to a diverse workplace, which is not well managed. Here are a few. Colleagues from some cultures may be less likely to let their voices be heard. Integration across multicultural teams can be difficult in the face of prejudice or negative cultural stereotypes. Professional communication can be misinterpreted or difficult to understand across languages and cultures. Then there are issues around globalization, like navigating visa requirements, employment laws, and the cost of accommodating workplace requirements can be very difficult. Garden, Swartz, and Rose define diversity in multi-layers. At the core are personality. What matters to each of us is unique to each of us. So how we behave, how we think, how we learn is all very different and diverse. Then you have internal dimensions, and those are things like gender, sexual orientation, physical abilities, ethnicity, race, etc., age, etc. External dimensions would be geographic location, maybe our income, our education, our religion, our marital status or our parental status, our personal habits, And then you have organizational dimensions, things like the field of work that we do, department that we work in, our seniority, our position within the company, our location. Different dimensions of diversity influence each other. And so each produce different potential issues and conflict. An organization needs to be aware of the dimensions that exist and what type of conflict might play out in their workplace. So for example, if you have a workplace that is aging, there might be age discrimination issues around diversity. Or if you have a workplace that is predominantly male, you might have equal pay issues with women. So you have to know what those layers are within your organization and how you would treat those challenges that might come up. Also, diversity traits are both visible and invisible, and both impact the daily decisions in an organization. In discussions revolving around diversity, visible traits are often what is emphasized and include those things like race, gender, physical abilities, age, can even be like body type. Invisible diversity traits are equally important and include things like sexual orientation, religion, socioeconomic status, parental status, among other things. And so in your organization, it's equally important to know those invisible traits that may or may not be talked about. The one that has, obviously had a lot of press in the last few years is around sexual orientation, transgender, bathrooms, et cetera. So knowing your workforce and knowing who is in your workforce might open up the door to different types of conversations you need to have. Unless an organization completely embraces diversity and sets a strategic approach to integrate the different dimensions to change the business culture, diversity efforts will likely fail. Diversity strategies will never be the top point in a strategy that the business has, but they need to be made a key priority. But because diversity can be so complex, it's sensitive, there are things that are invisible, the efforts need to be understood and institutionalized across the entire workforce. And because diversity strategies involve such major cultural change, there can and usually is explicit or implicit bias. Some ways to strategically increase diversity include the things that are on this page, like creating voluntary training, cross-training, maybe mentoring for various groups, diversity task forces, or even a diversity manager. Do any of your organizations have a diversity department or a diversity manager?
Can you repeat that question?
Do any of the organizations that you all work at have a diversity department? Specific?
Oh, yeah, we have a CDO.
Okay.
Diversity.
Chief Diversity Officer. Interesting. Does anyone else besides Sherelle? Okay. Often organizations will really kind of enter into the world of diversity because of something that's happened, a lawsuit or something like that. But more advanced organizations will create a strategy around it. And some of that will include some types of strategic process like this. So here it is. Having an executive commitment is really so important. We'll talk about that in a minute. Doing an assessment, creating an infrastructure, making changes to the systems, doing training, and then measuring and evaluating, and evolution and integration, which kind of just keeps it going. So we'll talk through each one of these. Without executive commitment, diversity and inclusion strategies aren't going to work, so don't even do them. But if you have it, you have to make sure that the workforce sees the commitment and ownership by the leadership to support diversity and inclusion strategies. I spent a number of years working in diversity, and I feel so very strongly about this topic. But part of the issue I've seen in many organizations is there is a lot of conversation about putting a diversity strategy in place, but the executives are not buying into it, or they say that they're talking, but they're not actually walking the talk. And so when that happens, typically diversity strategies are going to fail, because if they're not bought into it, no one else is going to buy into it. Then you need to do some type of preliminary assessment. So let's assume that our executives have all bought in and they see the value of diversity in the organization. Your next step is to do a preliminary assessment to identify what are the current needs, what's happening in the organization, who do we have in the organization, what are the demographics of our employees, and so what are our needs, and then benchmarks by which to gauge success or failure. So where do we want to go What do we want to be in the future when it comes to diversity? Then you're going to want to create some type of infrastructure. Typically, in larger organizations, there is a department who manages diversity. But if not, there has to be one identified leader of the initiative. Often that falls to HR, to someone in our organization. Supporting that should be ways that employees can provide input into the diversity initiative. This can happen through very different ways, but here are a couple different ways they can do that. This might happen via diversity councils or employee resource groups. Diversity councils are task forces that are created to define and guide the diversity and inclusion initiatives. They set goals, they set priorities, they make sure the initiatives are aligned to the business strategy, they monitor the progress, and they advocate for the initiatives. So typically diversity councils are voluntary and people can ask to be part of them. And if you work for an organization that's smaller, maybe you work in a mom and pop type of shop where you are the only HR person, having a diversity council becomes really important because you can't do all the work. You can also have employee resource groups, which are also known as affinity groups. And ERGs, or employee resource groups, are voluntary groups for employees who share a diversity of dimension. So maybe you have an employee resource group that's for African Americans, or maybe you have an ERG for Muslims, or for women, or for transgenders, or anything like that. It serves a variety of roles in the organization, from advocating for that group to social support for that group. And they become really important for an organization. People can select to be in the group. They aren't mandatory, but they often support the organization by providing advice, suggestions, improvement, etc., on how the organization could work better with their diversity dimension in the employee or customer base. And then you also could have strategic alliances, which are also for organizations to be affiliated with when implementing a diversity and inclusion strategy. They are formal links with national and global diversity organizations, which might include things like think tanks or lobbying groups, etc. So maybe a strategic alliance could be working with a particular lobbying group because you have a large demographic of a particular, let's say Muslims. So maybe an alliance would be with a national Muslim group to help you understand that dimension of diversity. So any type of alliance that's going to help you understand and maybe support the workforce a little bit better. Let me stop there and ask if there are any questions about anything that we've covered so far. Okay. Then your next opportunity is to create systems, make changes to systems so that they align with the strategy that you want to have around the diversity goals of your organization. Systems like recruitment, orientation, career development, comp and benefits, etc., have to change to support the D&I initiatives. This might mean creating new systems or fixing the problems that inadvertently discriminate against different dimensions of diversity. Here, I'll give you an example of that. So we were at my last organization and we were trying to do employee engagement surveys on a regular basis. And we didn't realize, but when we sent them via email, there were about 15,000 employees out of 50,000 employees who never received them because they didn't have access to email because they were working in hardship locations in various countries, usually in Africa and Asia, where they just didn't, they didn't have connectivity, and that's just not how they communicated. So then they never had the opportunity to provide feedback. So we were completely inadvertently discriminated against them. So we provided iPads in the field offices where people could log on anonymously to complete the surveys whenever they went into those field offices, which was a change we had to make to our systems to accommodate the diversity goals that we wanted to have in place around employee engagement. So think about your own organization, and you might think about these different circles that are on the page. Where might you be completely unconsciously or inadvertently discriminating against a dimension of diversity that you're not even aware of, or if you think about it, you're aware of, but you hadn't thought about it before? Will be something to think about as you're changing your diversity initiatives, or as you're implementing them. Then really you need to do some type of training. So you need to train people on on diversity. A lot of people don't grow up knowing about diversity, maybe depending on where you live, you just haven't lived in a diverse environment, or maybe that's just not something that has been talked about in your organization. There are a couple different types of training that you should do. Diversity awareness courses are those that help people develop a greater sensitivity to the changing dynamics of diversity. You have diversity management courses, which really equip management to effectively lead and foster teams in an inclusive environment. And then there are professional development opportunities, which might help people with a specific dimension of diversity develop skills to enable success. All of these three are very important, and they focus on slightly different things. So awareness is really about training for everyone to create a greater sensitivity. Management courses are really geared towards managers, and professional development opportunities are not necessarily classes, but rather opportunities to help people just enable their success. And then finally, you have to measure and evaluate the process and the progress of your results. From both a process view, how did we do, what went well, what didn't go so well, and a results view, what differences have our efforts made in the organization. So an organization who actually goes to the trouble of putting together a diversity and inclusion strategy that doesn't measure, you're going to get nowhere. So you have to do some type of measurement. And then the final step is to integrate the diversity and inclusion efforts into the typical everyday standard operating procedures. It needs to become just another way of life, meaning, so for example, rather than teaching a special class on how to recruit diverse candidates, managers are taught about recruitment, which includes the conversation about sourcing to find diverse candidates. So diversity right now is such a hot topic in the US that it is even more important for organizations to have a strategy around it. And that strategy needs to be one that integrates, this is just who we are. We are an organization that values the diversity of our employee base, and it values the diversity of our community, whatever that is, because that will then lead to people having conversations, which is the key when it comes to diversity. Actually having the conversation to say, tell me more about whatever dimension is that you don't know about. I'll give you an example of that really quick before I go on to this. This weekend, I was at an event where I was with, for my son, and I was with some other parents, and one of the parents has a child who's transgender, a young child who's transgender. And I asked her, I know her somewhat well, and I asked her, tell me about when Skylar first started to realize that she was a girl and not a boy. And so she told me the whole story. And I said to her later, I hope that wasn't offensive that I asked you that question. And she said, no. She said, so many people have questions, but they talk about us behind our backs rather than coming to us and having the conversation, that anyone who will actually ask me, I much rather have the conversation and open up that communication than anything. And that's really about diversity, at its core, is the conversation we can have about what we don't know or what we don't understand, so that we can all understand it better and have a richer environment. Part of that leads to providing our organizations and the people we work with opportunities to get to know different cultures. And you might do that by some of these things for both managers, which is what they're talking about here for sure, but anyone. If you're trying to create an environment where people have a global mindset, where people value strategies for enhancing multicultural awareness, you might consider, how do you do things like provide travel opportunities for people so that they get short and long-term exposure and experiences in different cultures? Or how do you create teams that have international or multicultural approaches, that maybe it's working with people from a different organization, maybe it's working with people who have just different dimensions of diversity. But how do you allow people to work on different teams to help develop cross-cultural management skills? How do you provide training, and what types of training do you provide to increase diversity and leadership abilities that might include mentoring and coaching? And then how do you transfer high potential employees into immersion experiences that have a lasting impact? So I'm gonna stop there and ask questions. what questions do you all have about the things that are covered in this diversity section that were new to you, that you hadn't thought of, anything in general?
Hi, Rebecca, it's Mary.
Hey, Mary.
So in reading through this, I just kept wondering, if you're a global organization and you've got a location in what would be considered like a masculine culture,
Mm-hmm.
how do you, is it just training and education with those folks to accept, I don't know, whether it be like LGBT colleagues? It just seems to me that there are some cultures that may be more resistant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so absolutely. So, and I think it talked about this in the book about knowing from a global perspective, what are the laws and what's the general cultural guidelines around various things. So, for example, Muslim countries that have predominantly Muslim employees or Muslims in their population, you have to know going into that type of culture what's expected, what's going to be allowed, and knowing the labor laws in those areas become very important. But overall, what SHRM suggests is opening up the conversation to say, what is the standard process here when it comes to promoting women or children? You know, what happens when there are children in the workforce? What are the standard ages? What is the law around that? And if you can understand the laws, you often can open up the conversation to what is effective from a diversity standpoint and what's going to be allowed and what's not. But when it comes to people who are coming from other cultures coming into the United States, even with diversity and inclusion, while we have to and we want to be inclusive, we also have to make sure that we are aware of human rights issues in the US. So even though, let's say somebody who's coming from Mali and who is Muslim, and they're coming to the United States, even though they might be used to an environment where women are discriminated against, or they don't make as much money as men, we have to make sure they understand that in the US, that while we value their background and we value their experiences, labor law is going to trump some things, meaning women are going to have equal rights, or we're going to do our best to get to that. Does that answer your question, Mary, or did I totally go off on a tangent?
No, I think it does. Partly, I just can see this getting so, like, such a fine line you have to walk depending upon the culture that the colleague is either coming from, or if you're trying to introduce diversity into a different culture. I'm just, I'm understanding that you really need to understand that culture. So, I mean, is there ever a situation where, like headquarters has a diversity policy, but maybe that's not rolled out to a location based on their culture?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I can give you an example of that, and then maybe somebody else has an example too. So my last organization, World Vision, is a Christian organization. And so one of the policies that they have in place is that whenever possible, a Christian is going to be in a management position. Well, because it was a private organization, they could say that. But in various countries that were predominantly Muslim, that wasn't possible. And so it actually became a really interesting conversation to say, as an organization, we value these ethical standards, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have to be Christian. And so one of the things that in my role I was really pushing was to say, we want people to have these values, not necessarily the same religion. So when it came to, let's say, hiring a management team in Pakistan, which we had to do, there was no way we were going to find an entire management team that was Christian. So instead of putting that policy into place there, we said, no, the policy is that we want people who have the same ethical values that the organization says they have, regardless of religion. So do you take a policy and put it in place in this, maybe you change the language, but you're not necessarily going to do every policy in every place, because you just can't do that.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Did anyone else have an answer or a comment related to Mary's question?
Similar to a nonprofit raising money for countries that needed financial help. There was one where I was in a meeting and they were trying to raise money or get brand new shoes. And it was to a country in Africa. And there were one person who was in the meeting raised her hand and she says, well, how do you know they want your shoes?
Mm-hmm.
In other words, they didn't wear the shoes that we wear. They wore other different shoes. And the guy the speaker didn't know what to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a good example of Western cultures pushing what we think is best on other cultures. Yeah. And that's a really good also example, Heidi, of just the conversations that we need to be having around diversity, which is, my way doesn't necessarily mean it's the best way. It's just one way.
Right. It's not like they're looking to wear Nikes. They probably have things that more acceptable in their culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Other questions about diversity or the material covered? Okay, so I've got some quiz questions for you. How do today's organizations primarily view diversity and inclusion? As a set of interconnected tactical challenges, as a set of quotas to be achieved, as a strategic asset to be leveraged, as a matter of legal compliance? Let's go alphabetical. So Heidi, how about you look at this one? What do you think the right answer is?
Well, I think the book says as a strategic asset to be leveraged.
They do. And the key giveaway in that question is the word strategic. Yeah. And I like the way that this answer is. It really is a move away from viewing diversity as defensive, as a matter of legal compliance. So it is more organizations every day are seeing, strategically, and quite honestly, for human rights reasons, we need to be diverse. Question? Okay. Mary, what circumstance tends to result in the phenomenon known as covering? An organization promotes diversity but not inclusion. An organization rejects assimilation as a goal. An organization intentionally excludes specific identity groups. Or an organization fails to implement a consistent diversity policy.
A.
That's correct. A. Missy, HR has been assigned the task of designing and implementing the training and development component of an organization's diversity and inclusion strategic initiatives. What should be the primary goal of the courses HR designs for management? A, helping them comply with diversity-based legal requirements. B, helping them overcome any negative attitudes they themselves have about minorities. C, helping them identify and overcome limitations of minority members of their teams. D, helping them manage diverse teams effectively and foster an inclusive work environment.
D.
Correct, D. Okay. Sandy, a female millennial programmer works in the IT department of an organization's Mumbai office. In terms of the diversity dimensions model, what is most important for a global HR to understand about this employee? A, that in a global organization, cultural diversity offers the greatest strategic advantage. B, that each individual is multidimensional and each diversity dimension influences the other. C, that gender has become the critical diversity dimension in today's global market. Or D, that organizational dimensions are ultimately the most significant in employee relations.
B.
Yeah, that's right, SB. That each of us is really more than just one thing. We're not just all women on this call. We have multiple races, we have multiple ages, we have multiple everything, cultures, everything. That's correct. Sherelle, HR has 4 tools at its disposal in influencing managerial practices and developing new managerial skills, often referred to as the 4 T's. Travel, training, and transfers are 3 of them. What is the 4th T and what is its purpose? Is it task orientation, teaching managers to focus on task goals instead of established processes, opens them to diversity-based innovations? Is it teams, working on global teams and international projects helps executives develop cross-cultural management skills? Is it technology? Mobile applications are making international assignments less isolating and are improving cross-cultural communication. Or is it tracking? Performance and process evaluation metrics can teach executives to self-manage their cross-cultural skill development.
It's B.
It is B, you are correct. Okay, back to you, Heidi. A company has been in rapid growth mode for 18 months and shows no sign of slowing down. Although this is good for business, the HR function has had trouble keeping up with recruiting. The Vice President of HR has received CEO approval for 2 new staff members, 1 new recruiter and 1 newly created diversity manager to align the organization's mission of celebrating D&I. The diversity manager will assist the company in improving the culture of diversity inside the office and creating a strong employment brand outside the office. The newly recruited workforce is made up primarily of millennials, and more established managers see the millennials' work habits as lax. Other related events the Vice President notice include a request to begin affinity groups at work, an LGBT, a women's group, and ethnic groups, a discrimination suit filed by a minority worker, and a request to terminate a disabled employee. It appears that the recent hiring increase has brought about an increase in intolerance. There are more issues of conflict in the workplace and less feeling of an organizational identity. Heidi, what is the first step the diversity manager should do to establish a new role in the organization? A, meet with all the millennials in the office to determine what their needs are. B, schedule a meeting with the executive team to discuss the departmental strategies. C, align the departmental plan with the mission of the organization to celebrate diversity and inclusion. Or D, prepare a plan to present the executive team modeled on a plan used by the diversity manager's former employee.
Align the departmental plan with the mission of the organization to celebrate diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, that's right. So the other one that is okay of the 4 is B, which is schedule a meeting with the executives. But you might not want to do that before you have at least come up with an idea of what the mission is and how you align the strategy to it. Mary, what is the best action the Vice President of HR can take to support the diversity manager in implementing this initiative? A, ask the CEO to make a webcast explaining the importance of the diversity initiatives. B, conduct a cultural audit. C, advise managers to slow hiring while the problem is being addressed. Or D, instruct managers to begin including tolerance and diversity in performance appraisals and promotion decisions.
I'm going to say A.
There's a better one than A.
B.
It's B. Yeah, so you're not going to necessarily do A because I think I might have said this to you all before. The question usually is not going to involve you asking somebody else to do something. It's going to be us taking some initiative. And remember the diversity plan, you really want to know what's going on. And so doing an assessment, an audit, what they call a cultural audit, might give us an idea of what the needs are in the organization.
But wasn't the first step we just discussed making sure that senior management is behind it?
Correct. Yes, you are correct. But asking them to do a webcast explaining the importance of a diversity initiative, we might not know what the initiatives are yet, right? So well, we know that they want to implement the initiatives. Really what we need to do first is make sure the first best action is that we know what the needs are. All right, so going back here to the question, we don't know of all of these things, what's the first thing we need to do? Well, we don't know. We need to know exactly what the needs are. So you're going to get the CEO to buy in on diversity initiatives, but right now we don't even know what the initiatives are that we need to do.
Okay. Okey-doke.
That ladies, is the end of that module. It's relatively short, but so super important for an organization. So before we go on to risk, and oh, by the way, we might even get to some of the CSR one today. Are there any questions about diversity and inclusion, or the test related to diversity and inclusion, or how you might do this in your own organization?
The only thing you said that was going to be on the test was the covering.
No, there was a lot more on the test. So the 4 T's are typically on the test, and you'll see when you get the key concepts, but there are a number of things on the exam. But 4 T's, that question is likely on there, something related to that. There will be a question about covering for sure. Sorry?
The 4 layers?
The 4 layers, often you'll see a question about that. Yeah, so this, going back to here, that, you might see something about that. More likely though, what you'll see about the diversity questions, so there'll be 2 or 3 questions on diversity that ask you about recalling the definitions. More likely what you'll see are questions like that last one that I just had, which is given a circumstance. I'm going to do this one, this rapid growth, situational judgment question. What should the diversity manager do? How do you apply what you've learned from this module? So the questions you'll have around diversity are going to be related to situational and judgment questions. Here's the situation, and how do you apply it? Other questions? Okay, moving on to this. Let's go to risk management. All right. Risk management is the identification, the evaluation, and the prioritization of risks, followed by the coordination of resources to minimize them. Risk management objective is to assure uncertainty does not deflect the endeavors from the business goals. So there's a lot of stuff in this chapter that I think you don't need to worry about as much as others. So I think that what happens in this particular one is people get worried because there's so many things around ISO 31000 and different standards and COSO and different things. And I'll tell you what those things are, but I think what you really need to worry about is how you mitigate risk and what you might do to mitigate risk. So let me tell you a little bit about the background. In 2009, the International Organization of Standardization released Standard 31000, which was risk management principles and guidelines. And ISO 31000 presented definitions related to risk, principles for organizations to follow in making themselves more resilient and capable of managing risk. And they created a risk management process. And they really built their work on the earlier work of COSO, which is the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission, or the COSO Enterprise Risk Management Group. And I say all that because I really don't think you need to know those different organizations, but what you do need to know is that based on that work, ISO 31000 created a definition which says that they define risk simply as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. Know that definition. They define risk as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And so they want, when they talk about that, uncertainty can be both positive and negative. It's not just a downside risk, but it can come from opportunities as well. In that original COSO framework, they provided a list of both the benefits of risk management and the barriers. Benefits include more strategic alignment, more effective, consistent, and quicker responses to risk, and a more integrated vision. From a barrier side, organizations that are siloed often respond to risk in a transactional operational way rather than through a strategy. It can be a more piecemeal approach rather than big picture. Cognitively, organizations have to have a mindset for change, and organizations have to be open to looking past just compliance. And culturally, organizations often do not communicate their appetite for risk with the employees. So people need to know what level of uncertainty the organization is comfortable living with. So thinking about your own organization for just a moment, How risk tolerant is the organization with whom you work? Are you one that, maybe risk is not very important to you, so you're willing to make bold decisions when it comes to business? Or are you more risk averse as an organization? Who can think about the organization and answer that?
I think my organization takes a lot of risks.
Okay. You're pretty risk tolerant. You take a lot of risks.
Yes, they want to try to be on the cutting edge, so they'll try to do something first or second or third, but they'll try to be on board as soon as possible.
Okay, great. Sandy, what about you?
We don't. And a lot of ours is because we are a government entity, so we're actually in a fishbowl per se.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, government agencies, not very risk tolerant, definitely. So it's important for organizations to first decide how risk tolerant they are, but for employees to actually know that as well. No organization has created specific categories of risk because each organization is different. So the type of risk that they might face will also be different. However, the ISO has created characteristics. So they talk about the known knowns, the known unknowns. And the way to understand these are the known knowns are the expected events that involve little uncertainties. The known unknowns are uncertainties we know exist, but we don't know about the probability of the impact. Unknown unknowns are risks we don't know about. And Robert Kaplan and Annette Mikes did identify 3 categories of risks, and they are things like, are risks internal and preventable from within the organization that could include, say, violations of ethics and failures in routine processes, or are they strategic? And so a desirable uncertainty that an organization willingly accepts when it comes to a strategy they're committing to. Maybe uncertainty on whether loans can be repaid. Maybe there are uncertainties about whether employees are productive or not. And then the third category is external. Sources of uncertainty that are outside of our control for whatever reasons. That might be changes in law, changes in economy, changes in technology, or disruptions in technology. And then from an enterprise and an HR perspective, we have to look at risks in terms of strategy, in terms of operations, in terms of reporting, whether that's financial or not, and compliance. And that is this. Strategy risks are risks that affect the organization's ability to achieve its objectives. They include things like investments, competition, employee engagement. Operational risks are those that affect the myriad ways in which an organization creates value. That could be something like data privacy, sustainability, supply chain. Reporting risks are those that affect the accuracy and timeliness of information about the organization's financial performance and condition, assets, misappropriation of funds, etc. And then compliance risks are associated with meeting the requirements of law and regulations, workplace requirements, reporting requirements. I have seen on various practice tests a question that will ask about that, and they'll talk to you about a specific risk and which of those 4 categories might that fall into. So you might want to at least know what those 4 categories are. So here's the risk management process. You want to establish the context of the risk, identify and analyze it, manage the risk, and evaluate. Throughout it, an organization needs to be communicating and consulting both within the organization and with key stakeholders. Additionally, it has to be monitoring and reviewing the risk and the strategies to mitigate it. So we're going to talk about all 4 of those steps. In the first phase, the organization has to get an idea of how much risk they're willing to face and what source of risk they have. So this is what we were just talking about a second ago with Heidi and Sandy's examples. SWOT and PESTLE, which you remember we talked about almost months ago, it seems, those analysis can be key to help the organization identify their risk. What is a SWOT analysis? Who can remember?
It identifies strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats.
Great. And which 2 of those 4 are internal and which are external?
Strengths and weaknesses are internal and opportunities and threats are external.
Great, thanks, Missy. What about PESTLE? What is PESTLE?
Political, economic, technological, I'm sorry, what's this? Strategy? No, I'm sorry.
Help her out. Anyone want to help her out?
Societal,
Economic,
Yep. And you said technology. What's L?
Legal.
Legal, right.
economic,
Economic, environmental, yeah. mhm.
Environmental.
Environment, economic, right? Those are the two E's. Yeah. So you can use those to identify your tolerance to risk. A key piece of work in this step is to define the risk criteria. Risk criteria is defined by defining both risk position and risk appetite. So your position is the organization's desire or acceptable gains or loss. And your risk appetite is your risk tolerance, the amount of uncertainty an organization is willing to accept. So Sandy said she works for a government organization. They are not willing to accept much risk. Heidi said she works for an organization, and if you heard her language, she said that wants to be cutting edge. They're more likely to have a higher risk tolerance. Risk appetite is affected by your strategy, your resources, by external and internal regulations. For an example, an organization has limited resources or limited cash will likely be less tolerant to take on additional risk than a cash-rich organization. And when an organization's risk tolerance isn't aligned to the strategy, resources, et cetera, the organization may have a conflict of interest. And a conflict of interest is a person or organization that can be influenced by two opposing sets of incentives. So if an organization has a conflict of interest, it means that they're influenced by two opposing sets of incentives. This may play out in one of the following. And by the way, these two things I think you will likely see on the exam, especially the moral hazard one. So moral hazard is when a person or a party puts an organization at risk, knowing that he or she is protected from the downside of the risk because they have a personal insulation against it. So this could be something like a CEO who has a golden parachute. They know that no matter what happens to the organization, they are guaranteed a payout of $2 million. So they might be more risk tolerant. They're going to take on the risk because they don't really care. Or it could be underreporting workplace accidents to earn an incentive. Or, another moral hazard would be, let's say you have salespeople in your organization and they inflate the sales that they've had so that they win a particular prize, if there's a prize going on for a sales competition. Those are moral hazards. A principal agent problem is a misalignment of motives. And this is when an employee makes decisions or takes actions on behalf of the organization, but has personal incentives that may not align with those of the owner. So they're acting as if they're an owner when in fact they aren't. Those two things from a risk management perspective really need to be watched and carefully watched, and the things that you will want to know for the exam. So let me stop and ask questions. Do you all understand those concepts? And can anyone think of an example of either one of those in your organization or that you've heard about or read about?
I have a question. Principal agent. So the agent doesn't have any ownership of the company?
Right. It might just be an employee or someone who's making a decision on behalf of the employer, but may or may not align with the actual management's decisions.
Okay.
Does anyone have an example of either one?
Moral hazard. I have a marketing who's involved with getting more customers, but there's a fixed way to get a customer by whatever product or services that we offer. But once you get them in the door, that marketing person gets commission, and whether our services is kept with that customer it doesn't matter.
Okay,
Does that make sense?
kind of. Did everyone understand that?
It's like, for instance, when you sell a telephone line and you sell it to a person that you know personally that will buy it, so you get commission because you sold it, but then that customer turns around and disconnects it in
Yeah.
30 days.
Yep. Yeah, good example of this, like kind of a sales incentive that they, yep. That is definitely a moral hazard. Okay, the next phase is to identify and analyze all the risks. The organization needs to be confident that it has identified all plausible risks for all strategic and operational aspects of the business. The goal is described with the acronym MECE, which is actually pronounced MECE. And it stands for mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. The concept is just as simple really as it sounds, although it doesn't really always sound that simple, but every point on the list must be mutually exclusive, meaning that there should be no overlaps and every item must be independent of each other. Also, all the items on the list together must be collectively exhaustive and express the information on its entirety. So no possibility must be missed, so that the list must account for all conceivable scenarios. With MECE, the organization has confidence that all plausible risks have been identified. They can take a variety of approaches to identify the risks, including things like talking to experts and officials, conducting focus groups, surveying, doing analysis on processes, and through direct observation. Really what they're trying to do is get the answer to every possible risk that exists in the organization. And they do that through the process of MECE. So we have exhausted all possibility of risks in the organization that we can think of that are known unknowns and known knowns. Okay. Then when you do that, after you identify all of them, each of those risks has to be analyzed to understand the vulnerability of that threat. They need to be able to answer basic questions on how likely the risk will occur, how will it affect the organization, how quickly might it happen, etc. And they can use a variety of tools to answer these questions. The first way that they can do that is through risk formula. This is the simplest, and it just calculates the probability of occurrence times the magnitude of impact. In non-work terms, what is the probability that I'll eat that candy bar times the impact if I do, right? That's all that is. If I eat the candy bar and I eat one every single day and I don't work out, blah, 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 what's the impact? Probability of occurrence times magnitude of impact. That is a risk formula. You can also analyze risk by a risk scorecard, which on this slide is on the bottom left. This goes a bit deeper and is used to gather individual assessments of various characteristics of risk. What is the event probability of each risk? What's the speed of onset? Will it happen slowly, gradually, or very sudden? How prepared are we to mitigate the risk? What will be the severity of the impact? From all of that, we can get a risk ranking, which will then allow us to prioritize our preparation efforts. So maybe we do this ranking and we realize that our biggest issue, like it says here, would be power outage exceeding 4 hours. So that's the one we might be wanting to spend more time on, or chemical spills. So you go the risk and I was right the first time, power outage. Okay. So you're gonna wanna make sure that you rank and then prioritize in the way that makes the most sense. I've seen, by the way, risk scorecards done where the highest number is the most important and the lowest number. So you need to make sure that you do based on what makes the most sense for your organization. Finally, we could do a risk matrix, which is a visual diagram that measures the probability of risk occurring, plus the severity of impact. The goal here is to prioritize the risk of which one is going to be the highest risk, both from probability and impact. And one example of a risk matrix tool is a PAPA matrix. And so you might have seen this, which stands for Prepare, Act, Park, and Adapt. With this model, you're looking at the likelihood that the risk is going to happen against the speed of change. So for example, if something has a low likelihood and is slowly going to affect change, slow things that might be, for example, let's say bullying in the workforce. The slow things have a low probability of happening. We could park them. It's not that we forget about them, but we might work on them later because they're going to happen at a slower rate. If, however, let's say it has a high likelihood of happening, but the speed of change is low, for example, organization with a lot of elderly workers, know that many of them will retire soon, but there will be plenty of notice, you might actually adapt. So slow things are things that we know will happen, they're highly likely, but we adapt to those trends. In our case, this could be, you know, something around demographics like that we were just talking about. So we adjust the systems, but we're going to adapt, but we're not necessarily going to act really quickly. You might have a situation where it's a low likelihood that's going to happen, but if it does happen, the impact is going to be pretty high, and the speed of change, how quickly it happens, is going to be very fast. For example, let's say a tsunami in Florida. It's unlikely we're going to have a tsunami, but if it does, it's going to happen fast. And so those type of things you really want to prepare for. What do we need to do to prepare for that in case it happens? And then finally, if something has a high likelihood of happening, and it's going to happen fast if it does, for example, an earthquake in California, you have to have a strategy that is ready to act when it happens. So you will see a question about PAPA for sure, and just know where they are in relation to that likelihood and the speed of change and what you do for each. So the question will likely be something that would say, if having a tsunami in Florida is highly likely, or is not very likely, but would happen quickly, which strategy would you use? Prepare, act, park, or adapt? And you would want to say prepare. So they'll give you a scenario, and they'll tell you whether it's what the likelihood and the speed of change is, and then you just need to know the answer, prepare, act, park, or adapt. Questions on that?
Yeah, Rebecca, this is Mary. So on the risk scorecard, do known unknowns and unknown unknowns and all those unknown and knowns go on there?
No, really a risk scorecard looks very much like this. So probability, unlikely, possible, and probable. You can, if you know, only the things that you know about, because the unknown things, unknown, you're not going to be able to put on there. So you just put every possible risk that you can think of. You don't dig any deeper than what you know.
Okay. And that whatever they were talking about, black swans and blindsided, do we need to know that?
No. Unlikely. I think that they go into a lot of detail on that, but I wouldn't necessarily need to know all that, no.
Okay.
Okay, so again, still going with and analyzing the risk, a key risk indicator known as a KRI is a measure that is used in management to indicate how risky an activity is. Key risk indicators are metrics used to provide an early signal of increasing risk exposure in various areas of the enterprise. Some qualities of a good key risk indicator include things like they have to be strategically aligned, meaning that they have to have the ability to measure the right things so they support the decisions that need to be made. They have to be quantifiable. For example, maybe damages in dollars of profit loss. They have to have the capability to be measured precisely and accurately. So when you're coming up with your risks, one of the things that you want to do is create some key risk indicators. How will we know that there is increasing risk exposure? And so you create some key risk indicators for each category. And another tool that you may use is a risk register. A risk register, also referred to as a risk log, is a master document which is created during the early stages of your project and is a tool that plays an important role in the risk management plan, helping you to track issues and address problems as they arise. The risk register generally includes sections such as the risk category, is it strategic, is it tactical, the risk event, i.e. is it kidnapping, something else, the classification, which is it, how likely is it, the KRIs, the solutions or management controls, risk owner, who owns this, and the reporting requirement. So ideally, from all of those analysis of risk, what you're creating is this risk register that has these categories in it. I often see something related to this on your exam. And again, it's a question that's related to kind of a situational judgment question. But once you analyze the risk, then you have to manage them. And so how you manage them, the tactics that you use relate to something like this. The traditional view of risk is negative, characterizing risks as threats with adverse consequences on project objectives. But current risk thinking includes the possibility of upside risks or opportunities, which could have beneficial approach or effect on achieving objectives. Despite this theory, most applications of the risk process still concentrate on managing threats, and approaches to opportunity management remain reactive. Because risk can be both positive and negative, though, there are upside and downside tactics for managing the risk. So if you think about this in terms of 4 steps, these are the 4 approaches you're going to want to necessarily take. First step is to try to eliminate the uncertainty. And you do that by optimizing or avoiding. So avoidance strategies seek to remove the threat or actually aim at eliminating the uncertainty. The optimized response seeks to eliminate the uncertainty by making the opportunity definitely happen. So if it's an upside risk, you're going to want to optimize it. So if you think, when it says upside, think instead of the word risk, think opportunity. And then downside, think threat, right? So you know that upside is always related to something that might have a positive impact on the organization, and downside always has a negative impact on the organization. But so if you optimize your response, you're going to eliminate the uncertainty because you want whatever that opportunity is to happen. So for example, the tactic here, they're talking about the uncertainty of the number of applications for an assignment versus a poor hiring decision. If it's an upside, you want to get more people, more applications, you include a guaranteed income provision. If you're trying to avoid it, a poor hiring decision, you might use more careful application or screening process. Questions about optimize versus avoid? Okay. Then, if you can't do that, you might want to share or transfer. One common objective of risk management is to ensure that ownership of the risk response is allocated to the person or party best able to manage it. So for a threat, you might transfer or pass third-party liability should the threat occur or responsibility for management. So this next one is really about sharing the problem with other people who could manage it better than you. And it could be financial or not. So if you transfer, you're going to, for example, if the uncertainty is around kidnapping of assigned employees, you might get insurance, because that's going to transfer the risk to the insurance, right? If it's an opportunity, you want to share. So the uncertainty is the ability to provide needed workforce during critical period, and you might engage with a staffing agency to get more workers. That's the way you might share that risk with another organization, redefining ownership. If that doesn't work, you might want to increase or decrease the effect. For risks that can't be avoided, optimized, can't be transferred or shared, the third type is to try to increase or decrease their risk. In the case of threats, the downside, the aim is to mitigate the risk to reduce the probability of occurrence. In the same way, if it's an opportunity, you want to enhance that by increasing the probability that it's going to happen. So if we're trying to mitigate it, maybe the uncertainty is vulnerability of employees to workplace violence. We might mitigate that by providing training about early warning signs. If the uncertainty is supervisor impact on employee engagement, we might enhance that by including communication skills training for supervisors. So do you understand the difference between the two? You want to mitigate something that's downside and enhance something that's an upside. Finally, residual risks are those that remain after we have employed all 3 of those other strategies and they've been exhausted. They also include minor risks where any response is not likely to be cost effective, as well as uncontrollable risks where positive action is not possible. So if let's say on the downside, the threat is performance related to goals, relative to goals, the tactic might be to accept that and take no further action to produce performance that exceeds the goals. And if it's an upside, vulnerability of workplace to acts of terrorism, which is an interesting upside risk, the tactic might be to identify as low risk and operate with existing emergency response protocols, because maybe we don't really think that there's anything that could potentially happen there. So questions about any of those four? Okay. The next step is to manage the risks by developing and implementing risk management plans. Some things you might do at this stage include defining objectives that are strategically focused, including metrics to measure effectiveness, determine who will be responsible for each area of risk, establish where resources will come from and what person is responsible for that, communicate expectations, including assigning a due date if risk responses are time sensitive. And then some common risk management plans include two things specifically: emergency preparedness risks plans and then business continuity plans, and they go hand in hand. Businesses have to be prepared for an emergency and plan for how the business will continue during that emergency. That involves both securing the health and safety of the employees and also supporting necessary human and other types of resources so that the business can continue during the emergency. And that really leads to a crisis management plan. To be prepared for whatever happens, you have to develop some type of crisis management plan. A lot of organizations don't have one in place until a crisis happens. And using the context for a few of us that are on the call who are from Florida, when Hurricane Irma happened last year, a lot of organizations in the area all of a sudden created crisis management plans. A little too late to do it during the hurricane, but that's what happened. A crisis management plan looks like this. Notice that the first step is to have a plan. That might sound simple, but as I just said, when the crisis happens, it's too late. Every plan has to begin with clear objectives. The objectives during any crisis are to protect the employees and the organization so both aren't endangered by the crisis and so that the organization survives. This written plan should include specific actions that will be taken in the event of a crisis. A crisis that is not managed well can wipe out decades of hard work and the company values and things that the company values in a matter of hours. And a well-managed crisis confirms that your company has the processes and procedures in place to address any issue that may come up. And a key step in the process is to recover, learn, and improve after the crisis happens. And just like in every HR process, we have to evaluate. So the last step is to evaluate for a variety of reasons, figure out, did it work or didn't it? This has to be done, including things like increased transparency and accountability, confirm that we are in compliance, and to improve risk management steps. Part of what you do is to include debriefs and incident investigations. While no crisis is good and no risk is necessarily always bad or always good, it does provide an organization with the chance to learn and understand and then improve. So this stage should include an after-action debrief, which is a lesson learned section to truly understand what happened and what we could do differently. Those of you who are in Florida, how many of you had some type of crisis management plan in place before the hurricane hit?
We did.
Sandy, you did? Mm-hmm.
Nope.
We do.
And how many of you after the hurricane happened had some type of debrief or incident investigation?
This year we are ready.
Yeah. And so that's often what happens. Afterwards, we become more ready. So risk management is not static. It is continuous activity. And quality assurance and continuous improvement help an organization remain vigilant. QA can be defined as an effort to find and overcome probable problems with quality. That is, directing the performance and behavior of institutions towards more appropriate and acceptable outcomes. And continuous improvement, also known as total quality management, is another way to improve quality. Continuous improvement focuses on the full organization and combines the methodology with the management philosophy of always thinking about how you improve your processes. So a lot of organizations about 25 years ago created Six Sigma departments in your organizations for quality assurance. And partly that's related to this, very much it's related to trying to figure out how we can improve our processes on a regular basis. Organizations are kind of moving away from quality assurance departments to having every department responsible for continuous improvement within your organization or your department. So Missy, I think I'm to you. What is an example of a moral hazard? A manager underreports workplace accidents to earn an incentive. An employee overuses an organization's health benefits, causing an increase in the plan's premium the following year. A retail manager overestimates an inventory count to understate the cost of goods sold, increasing the book value of income for that period, or all of the above.
That's tricky because you don't give us all of the above at all.
I know, I usually don't, but this question did. So do you think it is or not?
Well, I was going to go with A at first because he receives a direct incentive, but all of them are pretty good examples of someone benefiting at the cost of the employer.
Mhm.
So I'll say D.
Good answer. It's D.
Okay.
Yeah. I suspect you will not see an all of the above, but pay attention to it. Yeah. Sandy, what is a benefit of the mutually exclusive, completely exhaustive, MECE approach to risk management? Reduced involvement of employees in risk identification, confidence that all risks have been identified and analyzed, greater acceptance of risk management initiatives by employees, or reduced expense of risk management tactics.
B.
B, yes. If you've done MECE correctly, you have confidence that they've all been identified and analyzed. Sherelle, what is a risk? Organizations' high vulnerability to external threats, effect of uncertainty on achieving objectives, aggregate value of opportunities and threats an organization faces, or techniques used to minimize loss and maximize gain associated with uncertainty.
B.
Correct. Heidi, an organization is examining an online training tool that it could use very effectively with new hires. The HR director suspects that the tool could be used by other functions as well for job-specific training. The director invites those functions to attend a demonstration and possibly participate in funding the purchase of the tool. What type of risk management strategy is the director using? Share, optimize, transfer, or enhance?
Share.
That's correct. And that's the type of question you'll see on related to those. Miri, what is a good example of managing risk by transferring the risk to another party? Securing professional liability insurance, checking previous employers to verify applicant statements, reassigning a troubled employee to a more experienced manager, or designating a responsible party.
A.
That's right. And Missy, a nonprofit wants to partner with community-based organizations to distribute emergency aid quickly. What is the most likely source of risk for this enterprise? Donor perceptions, adequate supplies, increased costs, or liability and integrity of partners?
Would it be C?
No, there's one better than that.
D.
Yeah, it's D. Yeah, so you want to partner with a community-based organization, you need to make sure that they're reliable. Sandy, in a risk analysis workshop, the HR group at a credit card company decides that given the current process, there is little chance that someone who posed a threat through theft will be able to pass through the hiring process undetected. How would this risk be plotted on a risk matrix? Low impact, low probability, low impact, high probability, high impact, low probability, high impact, high probability.
C.
Right. Right. If they get through, it's a high impact because we're talking theft. but there's low probability that they will. Correct. And Sherelle, an HR task force has determined that storms could interfere with the ability of critical personnel to reach work occur with moderate frequency in a particular area. Forecasting has become very good, but not perfect, at providing accurate advanced warning. The group is using a PAPA model to decide risk management strategies. What approach are they likely to take for this risk? Would it be prepare, act, park, or adapt?
Prepare.
Yes, ma'am. Prepare. Exactly. Questions about risk management? Okay, how about taking a 3-minute break, and we come back, we're going to actually go into CSR. And then next time, on next Monday, we'll only have to cover employment law, which is a pretty meaty module. So take a 3-minute bio break, and we'll come back and do one more. All right, let's move on. Corporate social responsibility focuses on 2 key aspects: the intersection between the ethical behavior of organizations and their sustainable behavior. Ethics is about doing what's right, Sustainability provides the framework for determining what the right thing is. Corporate social responsibility, or CSR, also often called corporate sustainability, starts with the company's value system and a principled approach to doing business. This means operating in ways that, at a minimum, meet fundamental responsibilities in the area of human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. Responsible businesses enact the same values and principles wherever they have a presence and know that good practices in one area do not offset harm in another. Traditionally, CSR was about corporate ethics and government. In slightly more evolved organizations, it might also have been about philanthropy and volunteerism. It's changed to a broader definition to include the effects the decisions the organization make on their field of stakeholders. And that field of stakeholders has expanded exponentially to include their communities. Another change is that CSR has moved to the center stage. Think about your own businesses. Key stakeholders want to know what organizations are doing around CSR. More and more organizations are reporting their work in this area on annual reports or in separate CSR-specific reports. And corporate social responsibility has become integrated into a strategic approach. It's part of the organization's mission to achieve its goals. There are forces that are shaping these changes, and they can be described using that pestle analysis that we were talking about. Because technology is in each person's fingertips, a corporation's actions are more knowable. So when you think about pestle, right, this is really what we're talking about here. You've got environmental things. There are increased regulations and requirements, specifically around climate control, changes in climate and pollution that are impacting an organization's CSR. The global economic crisis of 2008 has had impacted sustainability. Organizations have had a harder time finding, attracting, and retaining employees when there are economic pressures. An organization who has an attractive corporate social responsibility strategy might be attractive to potential employees. And there's ever increasing pressure from civil and social rights groups. Certainly, this is even more apparent after our own election in 2016, changing public perceptions on key issues that shape what an organization does and doesn't do around corporate social responsibility. As I was preparing for this topic, I was thinking specifically about technology, economic pressures, and sociopolitical forces having played into a recent situation. If you remember with the Michigan State's athletic department, do you remember the gymnastics, and Larry Nassar was the team doctor for the Olympics and for Michigan State. Sociopolitically, we have the Me Too movement. Women felt empowered to speak up. In the case of MSU, one woman came forward and complained about the gymnastics team doctor, Larry Nassar, a case she had originally brought forward to MSU many years ago. Because of technology, the news about the initial complaint spread to where within 10 days there are more than 275 complaints, many of which have been also given to MSU when the women are students. And I can only guess that MSU did nothing at the time because of the economic pressure of the money gymnastics brought in. And I mean, I'm not going to go into how much I think MSU is at fault, or how people within the organization should, face charges like Nassar. But I think it's a great example of exactly what we're talking about here, how technology, socio-political, economic factors highlighted the concept of a failing corporate social responsibility for MSU. So all of these things really tied into the fact that that became just a monumental case against both the doctor and that university. And it is all related to corporate social responsibility in these four areas. So organizations' approaches to CSR move up a maturity curve from a tactical defense strategy, which is a position of compliance. We have to do this because we need to demonstrate good citizenship, but we aren't going to have a strategy about it. That's really what compliance is. Just something that's integrated into the daily operations of the business. Possibly there are products and services that are redesigned to be more responsible, to an organization that has a total transformation. This is really about walking the walk where the organization has been redefined, including the brand, into one that reflects a commitment and strategy to CSR. And some examples of companies in that transformational space would be companies like Ben & Jerry's ice cream. Its reputation for social responsibility goes back to its original public offering in 1985. That's when the Ben and Jerry's Foundation decided that 7.5% of the company's pre-tax profits would be allocated to philanthropy. They now reward more than $1.8 million per year to fund things like community action, social change, sustainability, and other initiatives in their home state of Vermont. So that's a really good example of transformation. IKEA is another one. IKEA's mission is to create a better everyday life for as many people as possible around the world. Last year, their Brighter Lives for Refugees campaign funded a solar farm to bring renewable energy to a refugee camp in the country of Jordan. This is the world's first solar plant built in a refugee setting, and it will save more than $1.5 million as well as CO2 emissions by 2,300 tons annually. So those are two examples of a corporation that is really in that transformation curve of the maturity curve. Think about your own organization. Where would you say you are? Is your organization in compliance when it comes to corporate social responsibility? Is it in integration, or is it in transformation?
I would say we were in the integration phase.
Integration, okay. And what makes you think that, Missy?
Well, being that we're a heavy equipment dealership, we're not really, we've never really been focused on the environment because we are earth moving equipment. So it runs on heavy fuel and, you know, uses a lot of fuel. And so we are in the process of coming up with more, with better ways to be as friendly to the environment as we can, as far as rebuilding instead of building new. We do all in-house testing of our machines, fluids, to make sure that they're not putting any toxins or pollutants back out there. So we're trying to get on top of that, even though the industry that I'm in isn't really one you would think would be environmentally friendly.
Okay, great. That's a great example. Does anyone else have a thought? Okay. So the foundation of CSR is the commitment to ethics, both as an organization and as employees within the organization. Ethics is defined as a set of behavioral guidelines that an organization expects all of its employees to follow to ensure appropriate moral and ethical business standards. Ethics overlap with compliance, as compliance is the act of being in accordance with the law. Ethical behavior is about acting according to core beliefs about honesty, fairness, responsibility, respect. Compliance focuses on fulfilling the technical requirements and regulations. So ethical conduct goes beyond simple compliance with legal and regulatory requirements, because behaving ethically means doing the right thing even when it's not required. But one without the other can lead to all sorts of challenges. So if you think about your organization, hopefully those two are kind of going hand in hand in your organization. An organization has responsibility, not just its own behavior, policies and practices, but the behavior of the companies with which it works. Supply chain is the key example of that. An organization has a responsibility to make sure that the vendors are also demonstrating ethical behavior. So an organization has to make sure that they have buy-in from their vendors to follow, at the very least, their code of conduct. And specific areas of concern usually are things like workforce safety, child labor, and supply chain sustainability. As with each of these, an organization could potentially be held accountable for the actions of their vendors, at the very least with a damaging effect to their own reputation. So often there's a question about this on the exam, and it's something like, and you might actually see it later in our quiz questions, but it's something like your company works with a vendor who employs children to work 15 hours per day. What should you do? And it's really related to you need to have your vendors agree to, at minimum, your code of conduct, which wouldn't allow for children to work those hours. Governance is a system of rules and processes an organization puts in place to ensure its compliance with local and international laws. accounting rules, ethical norms, etc. Good government starts at the top. The board of directors, owners, and senior executives have to model the ethical norms and code of conduct for the rest of the organization. When an organization lacks good governance, it will fail in one of many areas because stakeholders may try to fill in the gaps, but without ownership or buy-in. So going back to that Michigan State scandal that I was talking about, this is a great example of lack of good governance. Now, both the MSU president and athletic director knew about issues because they've been told about, and both have since resigned. Assume what you want, but if there had been good governance in place, when the athletic director refused to act, the president wouldn't have stepped in to make the change. But now it goes even bigger because the president of the NCAA knew about the charges. So there were also charges against MSU athletes for abusing others. All of this was swept under the carpet. So it's a great example of a lack of governance. Major implications of the organization, bigger even to that, reputational interest issues, criminal interests. So you have to think about governance as part of sustainability and corporate social responsibility because they all kind of go hand in hand around ethical norms. Sustainability is the practice of purchasing and using resources wisely by balancing economic, social, and environmental concerns with the goal of securing the interests of present and future generations. It was originally created as a term used for the ecology and preservation of the environment, but really it's the intersection of our environment, our social, and our economic worlds where people and profit meet the planet. And so this is part of corporate social responsibility because it really impacts all of these different areas. The sustainability sweet spot is the intersection between business interests and public interests. It is the place where an action by an organization can fulfill expectations in all three categories: people, planet, and profit, where the pursuit of profit blends seamlessly with the pursuit of the common good. Sustainability becomes an engine of innovation and a way to identify business opportunities, which for an organization can do things like generate new products, get at them into new markets or business models, and that actually meet the public's interests and the community needs. And it's really unique for every organization based on the business. The overlap between winning increased market share and supporting healthier lifestyle habits is the sweet spot. If you think about like PepsiCo, the idea of healthy products might sound like a stretch for a company famous for sugary sodas, but when they purchased Tropicana and Quaker Oats, they made the healthy product sweet spot the fastest growing segment of their product portfolio by far, with 2004 revenue growth about twice that of traditional products. So a lot of organizations are trying to figure out what are people really doing, what are they wanting, public interests, and what are our business interests, and how do we find that place that those two things mesh? And PepsiCo is a great example of that. You know, sugary sodas really aren't what people would say is a sustainable, environmental, healthy product. But if you think about now, all the vitamin waters, all the different waters that kind of combine those two things that are usually the fastest selling when it comes to those type of companies. That is the sustainable sweet spot. Sustainability also means that an organization has to expand who they think are their stakeholders. Stakeholders for a transformational organization are more than just their employees, their boards, their customers. They are all of those affected by the organization's social, environmental, and economic footprint. And they include these things that are listed on here. They might include local communities, the general public, financiers, academia, municipalities, and of course, the families and friends of those who are stakeholders. How many of you heard of Bombas socks, B-O-M-B-A-S, socks? So there's the sock company called Bombas, B-O-M-B-A-S, and they were started in 2013. They started this sock company, these two guys started this sock company to solve a problem. And the problem was this: socks are the #1 requested item in homeless shelters. #1. The organization exists for the purpose of impacting that statistic. That's why they got into the business of creating socks. From the beginning, they had a vision that for every pair of sock purchased, they would donate a pair to someone in need. To date, the last I've heard, they've donated more than 5 million pairs of socks. And their website is a great example of sustainability. The company itself is an even better example of how an organization who is transformational around CSR expands its footprint to see many as stakeholders. So if you want to understand corporate sustainability, corporate social responsibility, look at that website, bombas.com, because that's exactly what they're doing. They're trying to create a world that is sustainable by impacting people's lives in one particular way. In 1994, John Elkington suggested that an organization should measure its value not just by traditional economic measures, but also by its impact on the environment and society. An organization that wants to be transformational should measure performance with the triple bottom line by setting goals to achieve positive returns on investment in each of the three areas: economic, environmental, and social, not just with its profits. So if you think about your organization and you're trying to create some type of CSR strategy, you should think about these things. How could you have an impact that's economic? How can you have an impact that's environmental? And how can you have an impact that's social? And create a strategy that incorporates all three of these things, these areas, into what you're measuring. Part of the triple bottom line for an organization may be doing social audits. These are internal audits the organization can do to measure its social and environmental policies and procedures. It is a thorough review of how the organization and its members are doing in terms of these areas: ethics, environment, community, human rights, compliance, society, and staffing. And if you just think about that for your organization, you might have an idea of how much you do already in terms of CSR and how much you still might need to do. Part of that audit would be to measure the ethics of the organization. And that would require looking at the governance of the organization. One instrument of governance is a code of conduct, which are principles of conduct within an organization that guide decision-making and behavior. A written code of conduct helps an organization live the values it espouses. It is a values-based ethical decision-making tool that enables employees to recognize potential conflicts, recognize compliance and ethical risks, and then steps to make sure that you don't go down that route of those risks. And this table that you see actually represents the steps recommended to create a code of conduct. And this can be created at the same time when an organization does some type of CSR strategy, as they really do intersect. Do any of your organizations not have code of conduct? Okay, good to know. A code of conduct must have some key components, including probably a statement of the organization's values, including the commitment by leadership, the mission and the vision, the values and principles, and the organization's relation to the community, environment, and society. Then it has to lay out expectations of ethical behaviors, which would include guidelines, examples of ethical and unethical conduct, any rules, and a clear sense of accountability of how conduct will be measured and acted on. An organization has to develop standards of behavior, communicating principles, and training programs then on how to put everything in place so that the code of conduct really has a foundation. Then from that, compliance programs ensure that the code of conduct are understood and applied to issues as they arise. It must be supported by the corporate culture and have a comprehensive training component that teaches employees examples of ethical behavior and ways to respond to ethical dilemmas. The best starting point for creating a CSR strategy is by looking at the frameworks created by international organizations. So if you're thinking about doing one for your organization and you don't have one, start with the OECD. The OECD was one of the earliest corporate governance initiatives. It was based on the work of the International Labor Organization, we talked about before, and covered governance, workforce relations, environment, combating bribery, consumer interests, and the application of science and technology. From that, in 2000, the UN Global Compact was created, and it's the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative. It's made up of 9,000 companies and another 4,000 non-business stakeholders, and those are kind of government stakeholders or other stakeholders. One of the first initiatives was to outline 10 principles of governance: human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. And then the co-principles believe that the world business community should play an important role in improving economic and social conditions. Through an extensive and collaborative process in 1994, business leaders actually developed these co-principles for businesses to embody that aspire to be leaders in principle businesses. And they are based on 2 values. And those values were human dignity and a Japanese term called kiyosai, which is the ideal of living and working together for the common good. And I have actually seen test questions about those co-principles before. And it's about that value of kiyosai, which is the ideal of living and working together for common good. So you might see something related to that one. I don't think that they'll test you too much on these 5 different statements and standards, but you may want to know that one. An organization can also get detailed guidance on starting a strategy through the ISO 26000 and through what's called SA 8000. The ISO 26000 is the international standard developed to help organizations effectively assess and address social responsibilities. And then SA 8000 is a certification standard that encourages organizations to develop, maintain, and apply socially acceptable practices in the area of work of human rights. And so that's actually something that your company can do to get certified in CSR, so that you can say, not only are we a great place to work, but we're certified in corporate social responsibility, which means that we have things in place that another organization outside of our industry has identified as acceptable. So it's kind of a certification process. And then organizations have different ways to report on sustainability efforts they put in place. The most common are through the GRI, which is the Global Reporting Initiative, or through KPMG survey. KPMG stands for Kleinveld, Peat Marwick, and Gordeller. And they are one of the big 6 auditing firms. By using the GRI guidelines, reporting organizations disclose their most critical impacts, both positive and negative, on the environment, on society, and the economy. They can generate reliable, relevant, standardized information with which to assess opportunities and risks and enable more informed decision making. And so G4 is designed to be universally applicable to all organizations of all types, sectors. So it's a way to just, just report what you're doing in terms of corporate responsibility. The KPMG they've tracked the trends in corporate responsibility since 1993. You can actually look at their annual report. It spotlights emerging trends that are going on. So for example, in 2017, they focused on climate change as a financial risk, human rights as a business risk, and reduction of organizations' carbon emissions. And so you can see from, if you were just interested in this concept and this topic, you can go to KPMG, look at their annual report, and you can see exactly what the trends are for most organizations. Note, like many organizations, there is a process for CSR, and it looks like this: executive commitment, assessment, infrastructure creation, plan implementation, measurement, and reassessment and revision. As with any process, creating a strategy requires buy-in at the senior level. So you have to show the leadership that a CSR strategy would have value in areas such as growth, return on capital, and risk assessment. So before I go into kind of the rest of this, I just want to stop, because this is a lot of me talking and just a lot of you listening. So I want to ask questions that you have so far about CSR. How many of you have some type of corporate social responsibility process in place? And how many of you, is this the first time you've been talking about it?
This is Heidi. We don't have one in place.
Okay.
We do not either.
All right. Okay. So if you were to create it, the first thing to do, as what seems to be always, is get executive buy-in. Then in the assessment phase, what really you want to do is provide a detailed picture of where you currently are in relation to CSR and a vision of where you want to be. This requires doing some type of assessment to review current systems and procedures and gather input from stakeholders. Once you assess where you are and where you want to be, you determine what the infrastructure will look like. Will you have a separate department? Where will HR roles be? How will the effect be measured? And how will global efforts be coordinated? So there are a lot of organizations that are larger that have a complete department that all they do is social responsibility or sustainability. you can Google any of those companies I've already talked about, and you can see, you know, just look at their website, you can see that this is a big part of their strategy. When those questions are answered, we can begin to implement the strategy by following key steps, such as what are the priorities and objectives that we want to do? How are we going to implement it? Well, every company is different and will approach CSR different. Steps may include things like developing an integrated CSR decision-making structure, preparing and implementing a business plan, setting targets, engaging employees who are interested in this, and designing training around it, making things public. A lot of organizations actually created scorecard around this. So we talked about scorecards before, but a lot of organizations now are actually using this, creating a scorecard to be able to measure and then publicize what they're doing for CSR. So actually, it can be a really good marketing strategy. Regardless of steps and criteria used, some type of measurement, reporting, and evaluation has to be done. Is the organization doing what it set out to do? Who are we reporting the information to? And is there a separate report that goes out, or is it included in the annual report? And then based on the evaluation, we have to revise our strategic goals and our tactics. And we can determine where we are on the maturity curve and give the organization and all stakeholders an idea of where we are and what we've done and how we get to that next stage. And if you don't have a CSR strategy, one of the things to start is to say, let's assess our risk. If we don't have a strategy, are we at risk for negative public perception, reputation issues, because we're not doing anything related to the strategy around corporate social responsibility? And it doesn't have to just be environment. It can be things like doing something around corporate philanthropy or employee volunteerism. Part of a strategy that can easily be measured and can actually fit into a current strategy that you already have is around corporate philanthropy. Does your organization make charitable donations to community causes? And how do they do that? A lot of larger organizations actually create foundations by which they can sponsor and award gifts to individuals and nonprofits. They may partner with nonprofits. Some great examples of this would be, do all of you know what Make-A-Wish Foundation is? So Make-A-Wish Foundation provides wishes to children who have terminal illnesses. They recently partnered with Mustang, so Ford cars. They partnered with Mustang to help a 4-year-old with a passion for Mustangs have an unforgettable day where he got to actually work on his favorite cars. And then another example is Google, who provided grants to nonprofits of up to $10,000 to use in advertising through Google's search results. It's an amazing way for nonprofits to expand their audience and reach out to potential supporters. So finally, companies may create and manage their own custom-owned programs and charities, usually with a different name. Another way you can easily do it is through volunteerism. Really key piece and easily implemented and highly valued by employees is to do some type of volunteerism. When employees are not only given the ability to volunteer, but are actively supported to do it. It can have an extremely positive impact on morale. SHRM actually has its own foundation whose mission is to champion workplace and workforce transformation by providing research-based HR solutions for challenging inclusion issues facing current and potential employees. And so they actually will award scholarships to people who do some type of volunteerism. They've researched the benefits of organizations and the employees who have volunteerism in that, and the benefits of volunteerism for employees are huge, but obviously they include things like increased loyalty to the company, increased motivation, more reputational improvements for the company alone. So if you don't allow employee volunteerism in your organization, it's a good way to create some strategies and some easy opportunities for corporate social responsibility. So let me stop there. What questions do you have about CSR?
Can you repeat the survey or whatever, the research? They found that if the employees volunteer, they increase loyalty.
Yeah, yes. So they researched the benefits of the organization and the employees. And what they said was benefits can be for the individual or for the business. And they include, for the individual, it includes things like feeling a more sense of purpose and Then for the organization and the employee, increased motivation, increased performance, loyalty. People were more likely to stay with an organization who allowed them to volunteer. There were better reputation about that company if they let people volunteer, because people that they were volunteering with had changed their reputation. Any number of things, but those are the ones that first come to mind.
Yeah.
Other questions about CSR? Okay. Heidi, a firm discovers that a parts contractor does not provide sanitary facilities for factory workers. What is the firm's responsibility? A, it depends on local norms and business practices. B, the firm must provide these facilities itself. C, it depends on local legal requirements. Or D, the firm should request that the contractor provide sanitary facilities and begin looking for another supplier.
D.
Right. D. Yeah. And we have responsibility for our vendors. Mary, an organization is sending salespeople into a new territory where bribery is common. How can HR support the code of ethics in this environment? A, require salespeople to report bribery income and factor it into compensation. B, instruct salespeople to refuse service and leave when bribery is attempted. B, suspend the code of ethics because bribery is part of the culture. Or D, create ethical guidelines specific to handling bribery tactics.
D.
That's correct. D. Yeah.
Can you go back to the first question I was?
Yeah.
Why does it say, and begin looking for another supplier?
Because if that vendor says, no, we won't, then you're going to want to get another supplier. Obviously, they're a vendor. They are not your company. They have the right to say, no, they're not going to do it.
Right.
But if they do, that's going to go against what your CSR strategy might be. Or should be.
Okay. Yeah, I thought that line was not necessary. I mean, and if they say no, then begin looking for another supplier would be more clear, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's okay. Missy, an automobile manufacturer has a reputation for being employee-friendly, charitable, and innovative. It is also consistently praised for its high profit margins and efficient operating model. The corporate office is located in a technology-robust city with strict eco-friendly regulations. It is a community that is unforgiving to socially unconscious companies. Because of recent increases in revenue, the CEO seeks investment opportunities and settles on one of the company's suppliers abroad. The supplier has been struggling financially, but the CEO believes the company will be able to leverage the supplier's existing resources and generate additional revenue. CEO informs the company's leadership of the intent to purchase the supplier. This surprises the HR officer because the supplier has been accused of committing human rights violations and damaging the environment in its home country. In fact, the company has been fortunate to have avoided negative attention from the public about this relationship. The CHRO is extremely concerned about the potential negative attention this transaction could create. He or she emails those concerns to the CEO and suggests that the company should stop using the supplier altogether and partner with a supplier that is socially conscious. However, the CEO responds by stating that the purchase will positively impact the company's bottom line and nothing else matters. So, Missy, how should the CHRO respond to the CEO's statement that the purchase will have a positive impact on the company's bottom line? A, agree, since the purchase will most likely increase the company's revenue by leveraging the supplier's customer and strategic partnerships. B, agree, since the purchase will most likely strengthen the company's future value to all its stakeholders. C, send an email reply and present the concept of the triple bottom line to the CEO. Or D, ask that a working group be implemented to analyze the possible effects of the purchase. This is a really tough one, I think, in some ways.
Would it be D?
It is D, but it can be really tough because now you're going against what the CEO is asking you to do. But it's in fact D, right? So you're going to want to talk to the CEO first, I think, to kind of marry what you just said a minute ago. I think that the right way to phrase that question is, with the permission of the CEO, so you're not being looking like you're totally going against what he or she says. You should assemble a working group to analyze what those issues might be.
Yeah, that sounds better.
Sandy, what ethical argument should the CHRO make for the company withdrawing from purchasing the supplier and seeking another supplier? It would help avoid negative publicity and potential lawsuits. It would help avoid potential strikes and disruption to the supply chain. Building a partner with a supplier that has similar ethical policies would lead to better product and services. It would allow for better products, more satisfied customers, and working communities that support the growth of the company.
This is when you need all of the above.
Let's see. This one is a tough one. C.
Oh, without it, it's actually D.
D. I was on the fence about that.
Sorry, I don't know why I didn't show that to you. Hang on, let me go to it. Oop, oop. Oh, that's why. Here, I'm here. I somehow hid that from you. Yeah, it's actually D. Can you all see that?
Mhm. How do we know? So in C and D, it says it'll lead to better products. What information in the question indicates that?
Yeah, interestingly enough, Mary, just so you know, this is one of those questions that I've actually said to them. I think that it's a little misleading.
Okay.
It's probably rewritten. So, but yeah. So I think that going back to some of the things that are said in here, one of the things that he's really interested in is the bottom line. And so if you're trying to talk about the bottom line, let me go to that question for you. Having better products and more satisfied customers would impact that bottom line even more than some of the other questions, the other answers would. But I think it's not one of the best questions that is on the
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was hard for me because I was looking at building the partnership as well.
Yeah. I agree. So that is actually the last in this particular module. So we've just done 3 modules today, which leaves us with just one more, which is a doozy. And we have a practice session this week, that one next week, and then from then on, we can have another practice session if you'd like next week. We'll put out some potential dates, and then we'll just do a quiz on the 9th to get you ready. What questions do you all have? Is that exploding?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, I can't absorb anything else.
There you go. So let's end on that note, and we'll do some fun things on the rest of the
All righty. Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
All right, everyone, have a good night.